But I'm going to kick things off now. And so I'm Abe Newman, and I'm co-hosting this with Naz Barma, who, Naz, if you can wave in your box, perfect. Before we start the event, I just wanted to acknowledge that Georgetown's success today is in part the product of enslaved labor. And if you want to learn more about the history of slavery at Georgetown, please go to slavery.georgetown.edu. So Naz and I, we have been bantering about this for some time, that, the really international relations as a subfield has been increasingly engaged with issues of diversity and how it should be thinking about diversity. And we think that it's important now to spark a conversation in particular that's focused on LGBTQ issues. And so the vision for this series, which we're calling Outing IR, is to have, I think, probably 4 conversations, starting with this one, which was going to be focused on academics and being an LGBTQ IR academic. Then another event that will be more about policy, about how people that are engaged in policy that are identify in this space, the kind of their personal experience. And then 2 more, let's say, research-oriented events, one focused on studying LGBTQ transnational issues, and the final event is kind of thinking about queer IR theory. And we're open to more events. Those were just the kind of the first 4 that we thought were necessary. And we think, particularly given what I would say is an increasingly tense situation in the country vis-a-vis LGBTQ issues and the increasing, I would say, animosity towards the space. We just think it's important to start in our discipline to think both about our own experiences, but also communicate with people that aren't LGBTQ about what's going on in the field and how they might interact. So without kind of further belaboring what the point of the series is or today's event, I just want to quickly introduce our 3 guest panelists. First is Desh Giroux, who is an associate professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University, who is a very fun and amazing colleague of mine who I've known for a long time. Miles Kaler, who is a distinguished professor in the School of International Service at American University, who is also an amazing colleague and an amazing person. And Anna Meyer, who is an assistant professor of politics and international relations at University of Nottingham. Finally, I just wanted to put a wave and a pitch to Nazneen Barma. For those people that don't know, she is going to serve as my co-moderator of the event, who is a professor at the Scrivener, she's the director of the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy at the University of Denver. So without further ado, what we're going to do is just go by alphabetical order, where our 3 speakers are going to speak a little bit about what does being LGBTQ mean for them in kind of the IR profession. And then we're going to open it up to Q&A. And what I would suggest is that for people that, as questions come to your head or things you'd like to interject, if you can put them in the chat, then Naz and I are going to kind of aggregate those comments and lob them, when the appropriate time comes at our speakers. So you can put them in the chat at any time, and both Naz and I will remind you as we move forward, to keep that coming. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Desh.
Thanks so much, Abe and Naz, for bringing us together to talk about these important issues, and at such a crucial time. It's also wonderful to see so many colleagues here joining the conversation. I'd like to start by just saying some things about myself by way of context before putting 3 questions on the table that I've wrestled with in the context of being in the profession. I began the process of coming out as a transgender man in the last few years. It coincided with COVID, and because of the quarantine, I went through the process with a lot of privacy and stillness. I'm 43, so I started coming out in my early 40s, and that means I had 4 decades of socialization as a woman. I had years ago come out as lesbian, so I had some experience coming out and thinking of myself as queer. I've come out at a time that gender affirming surgery is more available, is very available, and uh, especially if we have the privilege of health insurance, has evolved to generating consistently excellent outcomes and is increasingly covered by health insurance. And we can talk more about that. I came out here. I've been living here in Washington, D.C. This is a very progressive city, legally and culturally, and it has a rich LGBTQ and especially genderqueer community and activism. My colleagues at Georgetown and beyond are lean progressive, more so than the colleagues of a lot of my transgender friends, and who are working in non-academic occupations. So I've felt embraced and supported where a lot of my transgender friends have faced transphobia and discrimination. On top of being in a fairly liberal profession, I was already tenured when I came out, which means I was also very well protected professionally. So bottom line, by way of context, I've come out in a relatively safe space at a relatively safe time considering where I live, where I work, and where I am professionally. So in a bubble with extraordinary privilege. Obviously, other transgender people, gender nonconforming people will have their own experiences, which may be very different from mine, and I can only speak for myself. Coming out as transgender, I had to figure out how to do and be in the world all over again. I often remember these lines from T.S. Eliot, that's to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Professionally, this has meant changing my entire wardrobe, changing my name, changing my online presence. But more than the mechanics, publicly identifying as a man is a very big and a very public change because I had identified as a woman for 20 years in the discipline. I had a professional life, but had to learn to occupy it in a way, in a new way. And I had to bring other people along with me. So I'm going to just raise three questions that my experience provoked for me. And these are in some sense also ongoing questions. First, there's this question I encountered of how much to share with people and when. There's the colleagues that I work with closely. There's students, there's people in my networks, there's people I kind of know, there's staff, there's administrators. So every time I go into work or interact with the field beyond Georgetown, I would find myself sort of navigating a new layer, a slightly different version of this question of how much to share with people and when. I ultimately handled it by sending out a simple email to everyone I work with at Georgetown and in the field. And I figured my colleagues would respond positively, but I was overwhelmed by the loving and respectful responses I received, which included a surprisingly high percentage of colleagues with a child or close family member identifying as transgender. So I want to recognize that many people are having these experiences privately throughout the field and that it really matters that we're talking about it. Second, I wondered if I can stay on as a member of so many of the women's groups that I've long been a part of. Some of the women's groups like WICS, Women in Conflict Studies, have welcomed me to stay on as a member, which means a lot to me because I've benefited and really enjoy the community. I think there's a recognition and an evolving recognition that the naming of many of these groups happened at a time when our thinking about gender was much more focused on the binary of male and female. That being transgender means feeling marginalized for your gender identity, and that, of course, identifying as a man today doesn't erase the 40 years of female socialization that I experienced. I hope and I anticipate that more of our women's professional groups will reflect on their mission for gender equity and perhaps aim to support anyone who brings gender diversity to the field. My sense is that that's already, that is happening, and I hope that that continues to happen. In addition, our standards for, citations of women in journal articles and of citations of women in our syllabi are extremely important. And I also hope that the category changes to include gender nonconforming people as well. Third, and last, it takes time to transition. All of the different pieces, I mentioned name change, website picture, my online presence. Coming into this Zoom meeting, for some reason, I think, maybe because I haven't changed everything at Georgetown, I still popped up as Desha Jarrad, my previous name. I dropped the A, but I could easily rename myself here. But it takes just a lot of kind of effort and attention, a lot of logistics. My online presence also, I think, will always have images and other things that identify me as female going back decades. In publications where I'm cited, or I've even cited myself, or where others have cited me as she, for example. Bottom line, there's a lot out there that I can't change. And then the things that I can change take time and a lot of work. And I'm busy as anybody. I only just recently, in fact, was able to get the process going to change my email in the last couple of weeks. I haven't actually finished legally changing my name and gender. So, there's a lot of this of the logistics that that one has to manage. And one decision that I've made, given the busyness of our lives as faculty, is to kind of let the mismatch exist, or kind of coexist with who I am. So basically to be who I am and not apologize for it, to let both pieces just kind of coexist at the same time. So what this means is, some people that I've met recently, especially in the policy space, who didn't know me before my public transition, they've experienced cognitive dissonance when matching who they meet with the online persona. So when they look me up, they see, Desha Jarrad at Georgetown. It's a little harder to find Desh. They dig and they find Desha Jarrad, both at Georgetown. And they told me that they've wondered, the first thing that they've wondered is, could there be a Desh Jarrad and a Desha Jarrad, both in the government department at Georgetown? Which sounds fairly improbable, but it's striking to me that they think that before they think, like Desh might be a transgender man. They've struggled to fit both of the images, in other words, into one category of a human. And again, my approach, because I haven't and won't be able to change everything out there, has been to unapologetically give people an opportunity to grow and learn because of that experience. Maybe it will show them the limits of their framework. I've decided it's not my responsibility to manage that for people. These have all been wonderful people who have, felt bad about the not sort of being aware that I might be trans, that they had assumed everyone they meet is cisgender. And maybe they will now encounter the world knowing some of the people they meet are going to be trans or gender nonconforming. Maybe they'll start assuming that there's genderqueer people everywhere. Maybe it introduces the possibility of carefulness when they would probably be otherwise assuming at default that probably was never true in the first place. To conclude, I want to remind everyone that the experience I'm sharing is my own and comes from a very privileged place. Being transgender in big parts of this country and the world is extremely dangerous today. And I say this also with acute awareness of how many of our colleagues are raising their children in these places. In the US, the latest I saw, this 238 anti-LGBTQ bills have been initiated just between January and March of this year. And most of these are targeting transgender rights. And these are laws aiming to make it harder for people to live their authentic lives. Republicans have been calling parents of children who need transgender medical support abusive, when what's abusive and life-threatening is not medically supporting their transgender children. It's gotten bad enough that people are upending their lives and moving, asylum seekers fleeing the repression in their homes. So I'm grateful that Abe, Naz, and Mortara and the University of Denver have all brought us together to talk about these issues at such a critical time, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks again, Desh. Miles.
Thanks, Abe, and thanks to you and Naz for organizing this. I'm not a very introspective person, so this was a very interesting exercise for me to think about my career from this very specific vantage point. And I want to emphasize at the outset that this is a very specific vantage point, and I'll talk about that first, and then talk about some larger issues and questions at the end. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but One observation is obviously the growing diversity of our own community that has grown over time, from LG to LGBT to LGBTQ to LGBTQIA plus for some, and each letter is a very individual life and career story. And I want to emphasize that we should also expand our acceptance within our own community for different life choices made by different individuals over time. And the dimensions of that diversity have been reflected in my career. I have benefited from what I call gay offsets, that is, characteristics that cause other people to overlook or sidestep the fact that I was gay during much of my career. I'm tall, I'm white, and I'm a man. And others who don't share those characteristics of general privilege in our society would have very different observations than my own. If you don't think tall is a feature, I can point you to lots of studies that suggest it is definitely a plus for most people in their careers. When considering my academic career in international relations, my identity as a gay man was actually probably no more important than the fact that I was a first-generation college student, I have to say, and graduate student. And I think that's important to bear in mind, that identities are multiple and complicated, and LGBTQ is only one facet of an individual's identity. Third, enormous amount of happiness outside my career. A 37-year partnership and now marriage to the same person, which was extremely important for my personal well-being and is foundational to any career, and also played a very big role in institutional acceptance, curiously enough. The fact that I had a partner, I think, actually eased acceptance in many institutional contexts. Fourth, and this reflects most directly on the international relations part of the career, I benefited from an academic career in large research universities on either coast throughout my career. I have lived my career apart from leaves in university islands of acceptance and growing support within local communities that were also islands of acceptance. In other words, large universities in blue states. I'll give you an example. When I arrived at the University of California in the mid-1980s, I applied for their housing support program. It was a mortgage subsidy program, basically, which they extended to married couples. So I appeared with my then partner. We were basically two unrelated adult men applying for this program. The domestic partnerships were far in the future. Marriage was even farther in the future. And yet the University of California was willing to include us in the program. I think we may have been the first unmarried gay couple to be included in the program without really blinking on that. So that's the kind of university I've been dealing with for much of my career. But that leads to a further observation, which many do not have careers in such favored settings. Here in DC, the bluest of blue jurisdictions, Catholic Universities Administration remains opposed to providing recognition or support for its LGBT student group. It is one of 180 campuses deemed unsafe for LGBTQ youth by Campus Pride. And if you look at that list of unsafe campuses, it includes a very large number of religious affiliated colleges and universities. Last week, the Chronicle had an article about another faith-based college, Calvin College in Michigan, where a faculty member was recently fired for officiating at a same-sex wedding. So my career is not at all characteristic of a lot of people in academia, whether in international relations or other fields. Large research universities have been in the vanguard of acceptance and support. Many colleges and universities are not there yet. So how has being gay affected and continued to affect a career in international relations specifically? For careers in international affairs outside of academia, I have to say the progress in the last 15 years has been absolutely breathtaking. I spoke over the weekend with a friend of mine who had a career in the State Department that was completely derailed for years because he was gay. And I asked him how much change he thought had taken place. And he told me that it wasn't even an issue any longer in the State Department, that GLIFA, which is Gays and Lesbians in Foreign Affairs Agencies, founded in 1992 by a very small, brave group under the radar, now includes hundreds of members, including straight allies in various agencies concerned with foreign affairs. Aaron Belkin last week, he's a leader in the battle, was a leader in the battle for LGBT members of the military, reported his first visit to the US Air Force Academy in 2005 when he delivered the first ever lecture on gays and lesbians in the military. No LGBTQ person would be seen talking to him at that time. They wouldn't be seen walking down the corridors with him out of fear that rumors would emerge that would end their career. And he reported on his visit last Tuesday to the Air Force Academy, where he met with the LGBTQ plus cadet group, who continue to face some challenges, but as he, and I'm quoting, but the situation is night and day as compared to 2005. So a lot of advances. What about my personal observations in terms of my academic career in international relations? Well, I thought about this and I recalled that an NYU professor, Kenji Yoshino, wrote a very interesting book more than a decade ago called Covering, about a feature that applies to many minorities, racial, religious, as well as LGBTQ. Covering, he borrowed this concept from Irving Goffman, means that people know who you are, they know about your identity. So outsiders are included, but only if we behave like insiders. In other words, we cover. The target is not the individual, it's the subculture that individual identifies to. In other words, we don't want to behave too gay. We don't want to flaunt our behavior in some way. So even in an accepting island like the university, my universities, does this pressure to cover still exist? And if it does, how do we challenge it? At one point in my career, I can say it was a factor in my avoiding a senior administrative role. I was in a search for a deanship. I withdrew because I felt I didn't want to deal with a donor community, which at that time, and this is some time ago, was substantially more conservative than the university. So I think there is probably still some covering in our outward facing roles as academics that we take on, and maybe would even be required in some outward facing roles. But covering leads to a final issue for international affairs academics that I want to raise. And we are not the only people in our field who work, I mean, comparativists, people who do field work do this even more than we, but we work with colleagues in many other societies that are not as favored as we are. Russia, of course, is a prime example that has made homophobia a centerpiece of its ideology, but it is not alone. And then the question comes up when we're dealing with individuals in those settings, and I've come across this issue when I've worked in Asia, do we cover to make our position, their position and our position less difficult? Or is it best to be out as a way of demonstrating our support? And I guess my observation would be we listen to those who are at risk in those society and follow their guidance and sort of do our best. But I think covering it is an interesting question for us to raise because we do get a lot of acceptance. We are out in many ways, most of us, many of us in many universities and colleges. But covering, I think, still remains an issue and one that we should think about, not only for us, but for others. So I presented a fairly sunny picture of my career, I guess, given the progress of the past 2 decades, and we can't not recognize that progress. But as Desh has already mentioned, recent events in Florida and other states make clear progress is far from complete. It is not unstoppable, and it can be turned back. And education is one of the front lines for the counterattack on LGBT rights. And it's directly associated internationally with the global rise of nationalist movements, typically led by, quote, strong men, emphasis on men, Marine Le Pen aside. And those movements are aligned with religious conservatives. We have Orban in Hungary, who's the new idol of US conservatives. We have Bolsonaro in Brazil, Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China, and then the aspirational strongman figure of DeSantis in Florida. So despite the progress, I don't think we can be very comfortable at the present time. And I'll leave it there. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Miles. Anna.
Thanks, Abe, and thanks, Naz, also for inviting me and organizing this. A little bit of context about myself. The words that feel correct today are biromantic asexual. I've identified as bisexual for most of my adult life. But I want to talk about my experience as a graduate student in the discipline, because until very recently, I was a graduate student. This is my first year in a tenure track job. And graduate school was the first time that I tried to be comfortably out with everyone around me. I'd known that I was bisexual before then. I had a career before grad school, but this was the first time that I decided to be out. And so the first thing that I would raise is that, and I think this is echoed in comments that Desh and Miles have already made, is that in many ways we are continually choosing how and when and to whom and to what extent to come out. And that I hope faculty who are not part of the LGBTQIA community realize that their students might be going through this and have trepidations about whether or not to come out, maybe trying to do so for the first time, even if they are older than we might expect. Because by default, our workplaces, I think, still are not fully safe. And by this, I don't mean physical safety necessarily, although I think for some of our community members, that is definitely true. But for many of us, it is a bit more subtle what safety might mean. And so I want to use a couple of examples from my own experiences to illustrate this. So the first story that I'll tell, and I will anonymize everybody in these stories, and I feel comfortable having them recorded, was for my second year of graduate school, which was the year that Trump was elected. And in that time, we were having a lot of conversations in my department about safety for a number of groups, primarily Muslims at the time. And there was concern about seeming too political if particular members of the faculty came out in support of Muslim students. And this felt like a time to mention, and many of us did this, that we would hope that if Trump came after queer people, came after women, all things that then did actually happen, that the department would be supportive, proactively so, of us, and assert that it would feel that it would protect us, or at least like be supportive of our right to like exist unharmed. And this was apparently a contentious position. As somebody who was only 2 years into my department, to be told by our director of graduate studies that it would be too political to say outright that we would be supportive of LGBTQIA people was a little bit shocking to me. And I went to a department that was pretty liberal, thought of itself as pretty progressive. And there are some very staunch allies in that department. But even so, to hear this message was quite striking to me. The second story that I'll tell comes from my last year of graduate school. And during this time, a conservative professor in my department conducted a survey of undergraduate students at my institution with a number of leading questions around the issue of hate speech. And sent out an email to the entire department announcing the alarming, and I'm quoting, results of his survey, where he found that some students were not comfortable with hate speech on campus, and he found this concerning. Thankfully, another member of the department chose to respond to this email and say, hey, in somewhat more PC language, this is completely inappropriate, and hate speech is bad, and like, what are you doing? And that was quite uplifting to me, especially in light of my earlier experiences. I wrote to this professor who clapped back and said, like, no, hate speech is bad. And I told him, thank you for doing this, because him doing this had made me feel safer in the department, to know that you had it, that queer people had an ally in this respect. And he wrote back, I don't think you need to feel unsafe. And I want to break down why that is not a helpful thing for straight people to say. Because safety is not only physical. Not being supported in a fundamental part of your identity is harm. And not knowing whether you are emotionally and mentally safe to share those pieces of you, and that you will not only be tolerated, but actively supported and protected. That lack of certainty is a form of unsafety. And so I think that the challenge that I would pose to sort of open up a broader conversation is that if your department is not willing to speak forcefully in support of queer and trans people, it is not a safe place for queer and trans people. Allyship and silence are not compatible. And so I think that we, as people who often exist in relatively liberal progressive pockets, need to really think, especially those of us in the room who are straight or cisgender, about what it means to really be an ally, and to push ourselves a little bit further in thinking not only about physical safety, but also mental and emotional safety. The last thing I'll say is I do want to end on a happy note, which for those of you who know me is a bit uncharacteristic, but I think it's important to bring a little bit of hope into this. As somebody starting a job in a new country, so I did my PhD in the US, but I now work in the UK. A little bit nervous about what that would look like being a queer person. And I have found an incredible queer community of scholars here, including in my own department. The people who have helped me the most to settle in have been fellow queers. The people who are my drinking buddies are fellow queers. And I just think that we have so much community to offer each other. And I'm really grateful that that exists now in such a robust public way. So there are lights in amidst all of the work that we still have to do.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all so much. Abe and I agreed that I would get to ask the first question, but before I do that, I just want to just thank each of you for your courageous and words and your honest and thought-provoking kind of reflections as we kick this off, and also to thank each of you for having been at different points for me, personal allies who I very much appreciate. So thanks for being here, and thank you so much to the audience for being here, where we have great turnout today, which we're really happy to see. And I just want to remind everyone, like Abe said at the very beginning, that if you'd like to ask questions, and we hope that you will, please pop them into the chat, and Abe and I will kind of incorporate those questions and comments into our conversation as we move forward here. So Miles, you gave me a new word, a new concept, the concept of covering, and thank you for that. I find it kind of very interesting. And for me personally, it's been kind of very much my experience. I identify as a queer, gender non-conforming woman. I'm also, obviously, I think to many people, a person of color. Some of you may or may not know I'm a first-generation immigrant. And what I sort of want to kind of surface with that is something that each of you have kind of referenced in different ways, is that we all have these intersecting identities. And as Miles said very clearly, being queer is sort of one of those identities. We can choose to uncover ourselves in different ways, depending on sort of how those identities intersect. I think what was really interesting was that each of you also reflected on, in many ways, your relative privilege in the power hierarchies that we all exist in, academia being one of those power hierarchies. So I wanted to ask you to reflect on where in your careers and in your sort of trajectories have these questions of covering or uncovering been most difficult for you? And thinking in particular about some of our colleagues who are on the call, who are at earlier stages of their career, who have less privilege in terms of most of us are tenured on this call, all of us are out. People who may not be out yet fully, who have financial insecurity, who have families of origin who don't support them as they're coming out and their academic endeavors and so on. And for me, I'll just kind of state this at the outset, just to kind of get everyone going. The point at which I felt that I could no longer be anything but fully out was when I became a parent. And so kind of these different stages in our lives as academics and also as human beings that kind of force these inflection points in terms of these questions about covering and uncovering, to use that phrase. Maybe we could just do a quick round robin in the same order that we started with, and maybe just a couple minutes each on this. And again, just to encourage everyone to ask questions of the group. Desh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's a wonderful question. And by the way, I also want to thank you and Abe and the others for being great allies through all these years. I would say that, I mean, in the context of coming out as transgender, I mean, it's such a public transition, and that's like an interesting way in which coming out as transgender, especially later in life, can be very different from coming out as gay. I remember from coming out as lesbian, I mean, I could go about my business in the department and really not have to let anybody know, unless something like what you mentioned, I had children, or was bringing my significant other to the holiday party or something like that. But being transgender, I mean, especially given that I transitioned after colleagues and have known me for 20 years as a female, it means that they're going to see me as a man, and that's a very public thing. And so, and as I said, it started for me. The transition started during the pandemic. I was at the time also directing a master's program, and the master's in conflict resolution in our department. And so I handled it by just realizing that for me, I just got very uncomfortable with she, her, hers. And so I just asked the sort of the staff around me and the other faculty to use they while I was sort of questioning and really figuring it out, because they is they can mean many things, right? And it's also a wonderful catch-all for keeping your gender private. And And so that's the way that I viewed it. And also there's a way in which we show allyship with our, with transgender, gender non-conforming people by declaring our pronouns. And I worried that if I didn't show my pronouns, that it would seem like I wasn't an ally in that way. So so I started slowly, and and sort of starting to uncover little by little, going as far as I was comfortable, and as far as I was certain. And again, because of the nature of the pandemic, I mean, I was doing this via Zoom, and then, only as we've kind of gone back to campus, and I've taken on a bigger, kind of more physical role, physical presence, I've, had to really come out, because I wanted to, avoid having individual conversations over and over, and just have it, be something that everyone really knew and understood, and give people guidance around my pronouns and so on. So that was my experience.
Yeah. Thanks, Dash. And I just your point about sort of supporting and showing allyship in a non-silent way, to pick up on Anna's point from earlier, to our students is a very important one. Thanks for raising that, Miles.
Yes, well, I guess I distinguish between being out, which is really what Yoshino calls when do you stop trying to pass, and covering, which means you're out, but you pick your social situations one at a time to decide when you're going to be gay or not gay in some identifiable way. For me, being out, it was clearly fully out was clearly associated with me having a partner, and that made it much easier for me. It was kind of unavoidable, and also because I was proud of having a partner, so that made it easier to just deal with people as a gay man. But in terms of covering, I think even now, it's a really situation by situation thing. I mean, I catch myself saying, for example, partner rather than husband, a more ambiguous term even now, and also depending on the social situation, do I talk about family, personal sorts of issues or not? And I think that's definitely part of the fact that I feel some hesitation about that still in certain settings. So I think the covering part, I think less professionally, oddly enough. I mean, I don't think at the university people know I'm gay, and that's just sort of, it's one of those things. It's one part of my identity, like other people have other parts, as you mentioned, as different parts of their identities. So there's not a whole lot of covering that has to be done there. Certainly, I don't feel that way with my students particularly, but in other, like I said, outward facing roles, if I were dealing with the community, if I were dealing with groups that I'm not that familiar with, then I think the pressure to cover probably is more present. I feel it much more in those situations. But it's an interesting question. I mean, I felt when I read Yoshino's book that it was a real eye opener, because I thought, oh well, you're out. That's hard enough for some people, but then there's this other dimension which follows after that, even in accepting environments, which can create a lot of stress and tension over time if you allow it to continue.
Thank you, Miles. It is indeed a sort of a constant process of kind of in any kind of new situation in which you kind of enter or exit, kind of having that conversation with yourself. Anna?
I think for me, the initial decision to be as out as possible and to not cover as much as possible was frustration with not being seen. So because I'm bisexual and have been in relationships with men, it is quite easy for people to assume that I am straight. And I don't think that I present day to day in a very obviously queer way. And so in that respect also, it is easy for people to assume that I am straight, but I'm not. And so I got annoyed with that and was like, no, I would like you to not make these assumptions about me. And so I'm just going to force you to not make them and be very loud about who I am and these parts of my identity. Where that gets more difficult is in understanding some parts of myself that I'm still coming to terms with and understanding, which is more the demi-asexual side of myself. And a number of the other speakers have talked about partnerships and marriage and such, and families, which I think for not only for asexual people, and there are certainly asexual people who are in very loving relationships, but it gets more complicated when partnership is not a part of life that is even in some ways intelligible to you some days. And I think that in my experience, even more so than being queer, not being partnered is something that people have difficulty understanding. And even sometimes not having the desire to be partnered is something people have difficulty understanding. And so there are times when it's just easier to be like, okay, we're doing the dating discourse today around the water cooler. Okay. I'll play into this. I shall pretend to understand what you all are talking about, and just use the phrases that I've picked up from being a person in the world for 30 plus years. And I wish I didn't do that, but it is way, way, way easier than trying to explain the alternative. And so I still do that sometimes, working on feeling comfortable enough to not do that. But I think that is also partially a personal journey, figuring out how to be comfortable with that part of myself before I can be comfortable with it with other people. So that's part of it too for me.
Thanks, Anna. I want to encourage people to, if they have questions, to put them in the chat. We unfortunately, we don't have that much time because it's an hour goes by so quickly. I wanted to flag two different issues, and you don't need to answer all of them, just pick, whatever comes to your mind. But I have one set of issues is really about the international relations part. So, I had a conversation with Simon Frankel a while ago, which was kind of about, we study a lot of very masculinely gendered things, guns and war and conflict, and the difficulty of being somebody who is not necessarily, does not fit into the culture of those whatever the tropes are, like how does that create tensions in your work? That I think that's one bucket of questions of kind of how the international. Miles touched on this a little bit about where you could travel in the world to do field work. There are other ways that this can manifest itself, but I think that just the cisgender dynamic of the field and how that kind of resonates as you engage with it. And then the second one is really more, it's a very, I don't exactly know even how to talk about it, but it's about how LGBTQ issues, I think, are largely unseen in the professional field. So I've had a number of different, very not intentional conversations where, I had a conversation with a female colleague once where she was discussing, discrimination based on her gender. And then, I raised kind of parallel instances where I felt excluded from, let's say, a boys network kind of card game or a different informal settings in the profession of how people raise themselves up in the profession. And she kind of was like, oh, I never really thought of LGBTQ people having these kinds of similar things. And so it's just kind of how you have that conversation with people in a way where you're not it's not about I'm worse than you or my life is terrible. I have a great life. I love my life. Everything's great. But there are these, informal ways that society works that penetrate the academia. And I think because often people self-identify as very open in the profession, we're pushed back in the closet of oh, well, these things, they're not apparent. Or so anyway, they're two different questions, and feel to, comment on both or just one, however you would like. And maybe we'll start this time with Anna, just because we'll reverse order.
Oh, catching me off guard, Abe. All right. So I'll respond to the first question more, I think, because I touched somewhat on the issue of unseen LGBTQ exclusion, pick a word, in my earlier comments. But it struck me as you talked about the ways in which what we study in IR is often very masculine, gendered very masculine. As a cisgender woman who has been very interested throughout her entire career in security issues, sort of seeing the flip side of that, in sort of being somebody who's really I am really interested in weapons. not to be a queer woman stereotype, but like super excited about those. Really enjoy military history. And even though those are not things that I study nowadays, but I am like a terrorism scholar. And so those are also spaces in which it's a very masculine space, and the ideas and ways of thinking about things are very masculine. And so I think that as much as we think about IR as a masculine field and the ways in which that might be excluding to people of particular identities, as with everything, things are intersectional depending on gender as well as sexuality. And so like my particular experience of being interested in these things and really wanting to study them, but being told that this is not a space for people like you, as opposed to perhaps having other interests besides those things and being marginalized in that way, I think is part of this as well. And is something that I still try to navigate as somebody who does field work with a lot of national security professionals. And in those contexts, I think I'm very much like the first thing to navigate is young, and the second thing is woman. And we don't get past all of that to other things. And I don't think that I've ever in a interview or ethnographic context like announced myself as a queer person. It hasn't come up, but also like it's just another thing to have to navigate. It's like we're going to go with the things that are most obvious, and about me, the things that are most obvious are young and woman. So like there's so much left to do to get down the stream to the queerness bit of it, which I wish was not the case, but here we are.
Thanks, Anna. Miles?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Abe. You know, there is a reverse issue, which is the assumption by some, perhaps, that because we're LGBT, we should be working on those issues in our research, right? A kind of an essentialist view, like every Black American should work on Africa as a region and not work on Asia. I've always resisted that, and I think we do have to, you know, avoid a kind of reverse stereotyping. On the other hand, I think about myself, you know, was it part of my covering that I didn't work on these issues at all, that I didn't want to be identified in that way in my research with those sets of issues? I don't think so. I don't think, you know, when I think about my authentic self, such as it is, that really just wasn't something that interested me, particularly in the way that human rights in general was not a field that I worked on, even though I try to keep up with the scholarship. So, so I'm, you know, I guess, at least in my individual perspective, I don't think that for me, that was a serious issue. And also because you and I work in IPE, which frankly, if you look at the actual numbers these days, is not a very male field. You know, it's always had it was always the part of IR, which was, I think, more welcoming of a kind of more diverse contingent of scholars. But I agree with you, the national security field is still kind of very male. You know, my view, it's the national security field that's very male dominated, but we have a very active Twitter group out in national security, which, you know, seems to be changing that. So I'm not even sure it's true there anymore. And on the other side, the kind of, you know, tenure promotion, all how you make your way in the career, in a career in the field, I think that's, you know, there are these informal networks. I mean, we're talking about networks, and although we try to have this meritocratic system that avoids networks of the old boy network type, they still exist. And I think that that's just a cue to all of us to be very encouraging and supportive of those who are out in the field, and make sure that there is no implicit or explicit bias or discrimination against them as they make their careers going forward. I think that's the critical thing. Of course, people have to be out. I mean, we have to know that before we can do anything about it, in a sense. So that's sort of a first stage, is encouraging people to be more out, and then making sure that there isn't any implicit bias against them in terms of promotion, sitting on editorial boards, all the things that make your career move in the field.
Yeah, those are such thought-provoking answers. You know, I would offer just to complement Mao's point that, you know, as we know, the world of international relations today is a disaster, right? We have you know, just such you know, severe problems when it comes to you know, climate change. You know, we've recently have been talking a lot more about international war. You know, maybe great power politics is kind of coming back. You know, there's just incredible amounts of poverty, and on top of that, the global South is very weak in comparison to the global North, and it has sort of little control over sort of all of the consequences of the decisions that are sort of being made that will affect them down the line. And one of the things that strikes me is that maybe this is one of the reasons why it's so important to have a diverse set of voices in IR, not because any of us has to study the thing that we represent, but I do think that when you come from a marginalized place and have that experience, it gives you, what my daughter calls sort of a superpower to, see things a little bit differently, see things that maybe the default sort of groups that dominate a field might not be able to see. When I think about the some of the biggest events in international relations, they have come as a surprise. In World War I, the World War II, Pearl Harbor, in Iran, in when the Shah was overthrown, in 9/11, of course. I mean, all of these events. I mean, the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring. These are all instances where the U.S. foreign policy system was extremely surprised, and I have to wonder if it wasn't so dominated by what I believe Susan Rice called in her quote, like white male and Yale, and I assume cisgendered. We might have a greater sort of diversity of views, and I think that can emerge in a way out of the scholarship that we do, and of course the students who we train. So I think we have an enormous opportunity. I mean, not a duty to do the work that follows from our identity. Our identity doesn't have to determine our interests, but I do think, so I agree with Miles on that, but I also think we have an extraordinary opportunity to use the skills and tools that we've developed navigating in society from this sort of marginalized space to maybe ask different kinds of questions that might reveal more than things that the world otherwise wouldn't know. Just to conclude on that, one quote that I think about a lot from James Baldwin, he pointed out that Black people in the United States know more about white people than white people know about themselves. And I think about that in the international context, that the rest of the world knows a lot more about us than we know about ourselves. And so bringing in this kind of diversity into our foreign policy thinking, both in policy and academia, I think could help us, make some progress on that.
Thank you all so much. Where our chat is lighting up, I've gotten a few questions to me directly. So we're going to turn to a rapid fire style Q&A here. Maybe just kind of a minute, quick responses. And I'm going to target our panelists directly. I hope you don't mind. Anna, this one's for you. We have a great question from somebody who's on the job market this coming cycle, who would appreciate advice on how to write a diversity statement without feeling like they are tokenizing their queer and other intersecting identities.
Ooh, good question. The way that I did this, well, two things. One, to think about the diversity statement as less about my personal identities and more about my ethos in the classroom and in my research and in the academy as a whole, and sort of practices that I engage in to try to encourage diverse thought. So that's one thing. The other thing was to simply, I did note a couple of times when my queer identity was useful in particular classroom situations. There have been times when that has been an avenue into talking about experiences of oppression of various groups, and using my own experience there has been helpful. And so if you can think of a concrete example where you've used your identity in a way like that, I think that can be a way to really talk about and mention that part of yourself without feeling like, hello, this is a piece of paper on which I'm writing about myself as the queer person, and here's all the queer things that I do queer, which you don't want to do. So hopefully that helps.
Right. So sort of like ask, show, tell, right?
Exactly.
Miles, this one's for you, and I'm kind of combining two questions here. One question asks about how different, and I'm asking you this one because I know you've worked overseas a lot, in particular, and in East Asia, how you've worked with people from different contexts and mindsets, and what kinds of tools you've used to interact with counterparts in different countries, and similarly, sort of how you find communities of support in spaces where these connections might not be obvious in international settings.
I saw that one in the from Korbel here in the chat as well. That's a really difficult question, and this is really directed more to people who are doing, I think, intensive field work, not just kind of conference travel. I have spent time as a teacher more than a researcher in East Asia, especially in China, and it's a very complicated question, I have to say, because unlike other contexts where you would actually be at physical risk, for example, parts of the Middle East, perhaps. My sense in East Asia was always, it was really just a social conservatism. It wasn't that, anyone was going to attack you physically or you were putting yourself at risk. On the other hand, people were clearly uncomfortable if you raise this issue in many cases, certainly in the past. I think it's changing a lot. But I mean, it's quite, in East Asia, one country has gay marriage, and that's Taiwan. So it's still a very socially conservative place. And I have to say, I generally played it by ear. I mean, I was usually there or sometimes there with my partners. So it wasn't like I was looking for that kind of companionship or deep friendship with colleagues. I tried to sense, step by step, how far I could go in sort of talking about my personal life. And I have to say, I was often assisted by a certain, I use the word social distance, but it has a pandemic meaning now. But if you know what I mean, it means people didn't ask a lot about your personal life. It wasn't something you did culturally, and that made it somewhat easier to function in those settings. But I think the argument, the question on the chat, others may have done more field work, like you, Naz, maybe others, about how you do this when you're actually out in the field doing work over a long period of time where your identity might really not be accepted at all. So then it's not just covering, it's are you out at all? That's a very difficult question, and I don't have really much experience that I could lend to that, answering that.
Great. Thank you. I know we're kind of running up against time here, but I'm going to ask Desh one final set of questions, which is about the one that's the sort of publicly viewable here, about how important it is for young scholars in terms of their careers to network with other queer individuals, how important it was for you in particular. And I received one privately to me in the chat that is, related, about mentoring our students who are LGBTQ and giving them the space to define their own careers, how they present themselves. Any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful set of questions, and I think it's very important. I mean, I have heard from, junior scholars, graduate students, junior faculty who identify as queer, or people of color. I mean, I'm also Puerto Rican. I mean, thinking about these intersecting identities. It's important for people to know that we're here, and also to help guide them, help them avoid, some of the hurdles, or to kind of overcome them a little bit more easily. I mean, I find that the mentoring experience, I mean, it takes time, and it's sometimes, difficult work, but it's just extraordinarily rewarding, and it's kind of also passing forward all of that I have benefited from in all these years, from the extraordinary mentorship that I've received.
Thanks, Dash. I also want to do a shout out to ISA. They have an LGBTQ mentoring relationship, a peering system. And so if you're interested in that, I'm involved in one of those right now. And I think it's really, important that scholars that have tenure, that are somewhere, that they reach out to, to students that don't, and to create those kinds of mentorship networks. The other thing that I just wanted to throw out there is just to not make these topics invisible. It's like we have so many undergrads that are interested in questions of, what does it mean to be an LGBTQ academic or a policymaker, but also how do you study these things, what's happening to LGBTQ populations in the world. Several years ago, I invited Philip Ayub to come to Georgetown and do like a masterclass with undergrads and graduate students on like what if we're interested in studying transnational LGBTQ research, what would that look like? And, just like exposing people and saying like, hey, this is a thing, it's like, I think it's a really important, it's very simple, but something to throw into that mentorship mix. I just want to thank all of our speakers, Dash, Miles, Anna, for joining us today, Naz as an amazing co-host in this series, to all the people that joined, and we'll be rolling out more episodes of Outing IR in the coming semesters. So hopefully you'll join us then. So thanks again to everyone, and same Zoom bat channel in the near future. Thanks, everyone.